The 9,893rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Maintenance of Peace and Security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Estonia, Poland, of the Czech Republic and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I give the floor to Under Secretary-General Mr. Tom Fletcher.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, since we briefed the Security Council on Ukraine 2 weeks ago, Russian Federation airstrikes have continued to kill and maim civilians, including children, and to destroy civilian infrastructure. A massive strike in the densely populated city of Kryvyi Rih in the Dnipro region last Friday resulted in multiple civilian casualties, the second fatal attack on the city in a week. According to the authorities, 18 civilians were killed, including 9 children, and 75 others injured when a children's playground and nearby residential area were hit. The Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights in Ukraine, which verified many of the casualties, reported that this was the single deadliest strike harming children since February 2022. In recent weeks, drone attacks have continued to strike cities and cause civilian casualties. Civilian infrastructure, including healthcare facilities, apartment blocks, schools, and children's playgrounds, have suffered extensive damage. This brutal pattern of civilian death and destruction in populated areas must stop. Hostilities have also continued in the frontline regions of Kherson, Kharkiv, Donetsk, and the border areas of Sumy, causing extensive damage. More than 90 civilian casualties were recorded in those regions last week, according to authorities. I saw the impact of these types of attacks firsthand when I visited Ukraine earlier this year. From the families I met in frontline areas near Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region to Kupiansk town in the Kharkiv region, they displayed courage, resilience, and determination to rebuild their lives and their homes. But also understandable exhaustion, anger, and despair that these attacks continue. Mr. President, they are right to be angry because civilians are paying a devastating price for this horrendous war. OHCHR has now verified the killing of at least 12,910 civilians, including 682 children, and the injury of almost 30,700 across Ukraine from 24th of Feb 2022 to 31st of March 2025. The true toll is likely to be far greater. Nearly 3.7 million people remain internally displaced, with new waves of displacement in the country's northeast due to hostilities. Children and their caregivers are being evacuated from several frontline towns. There are almost 7 million refugees from Ukraine recorded globally, mainly in Europe. Media reports also indicate civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure in the Kursk, Belgorod and Bryansk regions of the Russian Federation. and we remain unable to reach an estimated 1.5 million civilians who require assistance in parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia regions under occupation by the Russian Federation. International humanitarian law demands that the parties facilitate rapid, unimpeded access for humanitarian relief for those civilians in need, wherever they are. Mr. President, yesterday marked World Health Day, a moment to reflect on the urgent need to safeguard maternal and reproductive health, especially in crisis settings. A new report released by WHO, UNFPA, and UNICEF highlights the state of maternal mortality worldwide, including the devastating toll of conflict on women's health. In Ukraine, women and girls are facing a special crisis. Since February 2022, preterm births have made up nearly 50% of all deliveries, putting both mothers and newborns at high risk. Intimate partner violence, including other forms of gender-based violence, has surged 36% during this period. Displaced women, especially refugees, are among those facing the most severe mental health challenges, with limited access to protection and care. Mr. President, almost 13 million people across Ukraine need humanitarian support. The majority are women, children, older people, and people with disabilities. In the first 2 months of 2025, 290 humanitarian organizations, many national NGOs, reached 1.7 million people with vital aid and services, including emergency support following strikes. Thanks to the generosity of donors, 17% of the $2.6 billion needed for the 2025 Ukraine Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan that I launched with Filippo Grandi in January in Kyiv has been secured. But far more is clearly needed. And of course, now we're having to scale back critical programs. As part of our wider humanitarian reset in response to funding cuts, we and partners are focusing limited resources on just 4 strategic, urgent priorities: supporting frontline communities, the emergency response, facilitating evacuations, and helping the displaced. Increased financial support is vital to ensure humanitarian operations can continue reaching those most in need. Every contribution makes a difference. Mr. President, we welcome the announcement of a ceasefire focused on energy infrastructure, as well as negotiations to ensure safe navigation in the Black Sea. Ultimately, the best protection of civilians is that this war ends. Until it does, the negotiating priority, whether as part of a temporary pause or a lasting agreement, must start from the needs and protection of civilians. And while talks continue, the fighting rages on. Civilians continue to suffer, and the humanitarian crisis deepens by the day. Mr. President, my 2 asks today of the Security Council, and indeed the wider international community, go beyond Ukraine alone. Firstly, I must reiterate that under international humanitarian law that this Council is here to defend, parties to conflicts must protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Indiscriminate attacks on civilians are strictly prohibited. There must be limits to how war is waged. At its best, this Council and the member states here have upheld that idea that even wars have rules. Is that not why we are here? And yet, on my visits from Ukraine to Gaza, to Sudan, to Lebanon, to Myanmar, from where I returned yesterday, I'm seeing the opposite. that not only are we not standing robustly for international law, but in some cases we are supporting its debasement. That's the common thread that links these conflicts. And if your principles apply only to your opponents, then they are not humanitarian principles. The world is getting more dangerous for civilians. On our watch, please, you can do more to ensure that this era of increasingly belligerent, transactional, self-defeating nationalism is not also remembered as one of callous impunity and brutal indifference, in which the rights of civilians are discarded again and again with a shrug. If we do not make our stand on this point consistently and unequivocally, then what do we stand for anymore? And how can we expect anyone to listen to us or hope that others will make better choices in the future? My second ask, Mr. President, is, of course, for the funding to save lives in an increasingly dangerous environment and this era of savage cuts. If you cannot stop the attacks on civilians in Ukraine and elsewhere, please at least give us the security to operate and the resources we need to save as many survivors as we can. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank Under-Secretary General Fletcher for his briefing and comments, and I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Denmark. You have the floor, madam. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank Under-Secretary General Fletcher for his sobering briefing. Colleagues, it was only 2 weeks ago we gathered in this chamber to discuss the terrible humanitarian suffering caused by Russia's illegal war of choice on the people of Ukraine. Today we convene, tragically, in the aftermath of yet another Russian mass casualty attack. As we just heard from Under-Secretary General Fletcher, on 4th April, a missile strike on Kryvyi Rih killed at least 20 civilians, including 9 children. A further 61 civilians were injured, again including many children. Russia has said it only attacks military targets. But let us be clear. This was a ballistic missile, armed with cluster munitions to maximize casualties, that hit residential buildings and a playground in one of Ukraine's most populous cities. This is a display of complete disregard for civilian lives. We condemn these despicable actions in the strongest terms. Attacks can only be directed against military objectives and may never be directed against civilians or civilian objects, as the Under-Secretary General just underlined. Despite the scale of the horrors in Kryvyi Rih, we must remember that it was just one of Russia's daily attacks affecting Ukraine's civilian populations. 5 civilians were also killed in Kharkiv on 3rd April, including a child, with at least 34 civilians injured. The following night, there was another fatal attack in Donetsk, and further attacks with civilian casualties in Kyiv, as well as Sumy, Donetsk, and Zaporizhzhia regions. An endless Russian aerial blitz meant to terrorize Ukraine's civilians. Mr. President, Russia could end the war today if it would only stop attacking Ukraine. Instead, it raises new preconditions for even a partial ceasefire, while increasing its attacks on Ukrainian civilians, resulting in further humanitarian suffering. These are not good faith actions by a country generally interested in negotiating a comprehensive ceasefire. These are not the actions of a country that shows any intention to implement the limited ceasefires it claims to have agreed to. Indeed, the deliberate delays and new preconditions raised seems particularly cynical given reports that the missile that struck Kryvyi Rih was fired from the Black Sea. Ukraine, on the other hand, has taken the first meaningful steps towards peace with its offer of an immediate and complete 30-day ceasefire. It is now for Russia to take genuine steps that respond to Ukraine's offers and build on this momentum without further delay. The objective remains achieving a just and lasting peace in line with the principles of the UN Charter. This was precisely what the majority of UN members clearly demanded on the 3rd anniversary of Russia's illegal full-scale invasion. They stood with the people of Ukraine and reaffirmed their commitment to its sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. In closing, Denmark will continue to stand with Ukraine as we, hopefully, move closer towards a comprehensive and enduring peace built on accountability and justice. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Denmark, and I now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Panama. Thank you, Mr. President. Panama would like to thank the Presidency for having called this meeting, and we'd like to thank Mr. Tom Fletcher for his participation, and the Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. We thank him for his detailed briefing. We recognize the presence of the representatives of the delegations of Ukraine, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Poland, and the European Union, who honor us today with their participation in the meeting. Just 2 weeks ago, we met in this council, concerned at the increase of attacks against the civilian population in Ukraine. We were drawing hope from the promise of a supposed new era of dialogue and diplomatic rapprochement, which at the time was encouraging, but unfortunately now that encouragement has been lost. For peace, a priority must always be to guarantee the security of the civilian population. However, the hostilities continue and the attacks continue to affect the civilian population. Panama laments the facts described by the High Commissioner of the United Nations, Volker Turk, with regard to the attacks of the 4th of April on the Ukrainian city of Kryvyi Rih in a densely populated area, whilst entire families with their children were playing in a playground, or they were in restaurants or in residential buildings. A first missile attack led to the death of 18 civilians, amongst them 9 children, and 62 people were wounded, of which 12 are children. This attack was followed up by others with drones, whilst the rescue operations were being carried out by the emergency services, which led to the death of 1 person and injured another 7. Children must never be targets in a war. The images and the testimonies are heartrending. These deaths are the direct result of violence which does not seem to distinguish between combatants and civilians, and which particularly affects the most innocent. Therefore, we insist that in any conflict, children, irrespective of their nationality, must be protected from the horrors of war. They are innocent and do not deserve to be victims. For all of these reasons, we feel that the call of the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Human Rights is justified, namely that, just as in any similar case, an exhaustive and independent investigation be carried out of this attack, described by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations in Ukraine as the most lethal verified attack against minors since February 2022. Panama vehemently reiterates its call for a total cessation of hostilities by the parties, respect for the territorial integrity of states, respect for international law and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Panama offers its condolences for the attacks on the civilian population, particularly those affecting children, in all armed conflicts. We are aware, based on the experience of our own history, that these wounds continue in society for generations to come. They are human tragedies with ongoing after-effects on the life of states and of people. In this regard, we support the diplomatic and political efforts based on the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter for negotiation leading to a just and lasting peace, which will only be possible if there is a halt to the attacks against the civilian population and critical infrastructure. Thank you very much. I thank the Permanent Representative of Panama for his statement. I now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Greece. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
At the outset, I would like to thank Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher for his briefing. Mr. President, hardly 2 weeks ago, we discussed in this chamber the ongoing humanitarian suffering in Ukraine following Russia's continuing intensifying aggression. Unfortunately, our calls to Russia to cease immediately the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure have been completely ignored, and Ukrainians suffer the consequences as they have in the course of 3 years of relentless war. Every day in recent weeks, we have seen new missile and drone strikes across Ukraine, causing dozens of civilian casualties. On April 4, a single strike in the residential area of Kryvyi has caused 18 deaths and over 60 injuries. What is particularly deplorable is the indiscriminate nature of this attack, which also targeted a children's playground, claiming the life of 9 children. Indiscriminate attacks are prohibited under international humanitarian law, and if they amount to attacks directed against civilians, may constitute war crimes. Greece deplores all attacks against civilians and civilian objects and calls on Russia to immediately cease all attacks against residential areas and critical infrastructure in Ukraine. All parties must adhere to the obligation under international law, including international humanitarian law. Mr. President, respect for international law and humanitarian law should go hand in hand with accountability for the perpetrators and justice for the victims, and remain crucial for a just and lasting peace. We firmly believe that violations of international humanitarian law and war crimes should be thoroughly investigated by the relevant international institutions, and the perpetrators, whoever they may be brought to justice. Mr. President, Greece has taken note of the latest advancements for peace in Saudi Arabia, following the US initiative, in the hope that it will lead, sooner rather than later, to a full ceasefire. We also welcome the fact that Ukraine participates in these deliberations, and regret that Russia has not accepted the agreement between the United States and Ukraine for a full and immediate ceasefire. In this respect, current deadly attacks against Ukrainian civilians seriously undermine peace efforts and demonstrates Russia's lack of goodwill. We hope that the 30-day ceasefire on energy infrastructure and on freedom of navigation and elimination of the use of force in the Black Sea will be implemented. We echo the Secretary General's statements that an agreement on freedom of navigation in the Black Sea will be a crucial contribution to global food security and supply chains. Mr. President, much more needs to be done to lead from a fragile and partial ceasefire to just, comprehensive and lasting peace. We need to harness the benefit of inclusive diplomacy to establish a solid framework for peace, security and prosperity. A peace based on the UN Charter and international law, in full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and on credible and robust security guarantees which will deter and prevent the recurrence of war in the future. Mr. President, in closing, let me reiterate that sustainable peace in Ukraine requires the active engagement of the whole international community, given the regional and global repercussions of the ongoing war. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Greece for his statement. I now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, before I start my statement, I would like to state yet once again that members of the European Union are moving forward an unacceptable practice of inviting an excessive number of delegations representing the European Union and NATO under Rule 37. And we have stated several times there is no added value that members of a bloc state that can be brought to our meetings. We will hear once again the same notions, the same variations on the same theme. And we regret the fact that the French presidency decided to disregard the rules of procedure of the Council. Mr. President, the formal reason for the convening of the European accolades of the Kiev regime of the meeting of the Security Council today was the fact that the Russian forces delivered a strike on the 4th of April on one of the restaurants in Kryvyi Rog. As the Ministry of Defense of Russia stated, as a result of a precision missile strike with a high explosive charge against the location of a meeting of unit commanders and Western instructors. As a result of that, the damage was about 85 servicemen and officers of warring states and about 20 auto vehicles. This operation unquestionably did damage to the command of the Ukrainian forces and a number of NATO armies who had sent their instructors to Ukraine. And in this context, we would like to recall that we on many occasions warned that a gathering of service members as well as that of Western officers and instructors sent to help Kiev, that all of these are legitimate targets for the Russian army. Unfortunately, because of unprofessional actions by the Ukrainian air defense, the intercepting Ukrainian missile was the reason for the civilian lives lost in the territories next to the restaurant. In any event, that is what is being showed by the characteristics of the warheads, which had been witnessed by eyewitnesses, those who happened to be right next to the restaurant at the moment of their death. The fact that there was a military meeting in one of an urban areas with the dense residential buildings also shows that the Kiev regime has disregard for the lives of peaceful Ukrainians who are being used essentially as a human shield to cover for their military activity. Despite the fact that the military targets, the fact that they were attained, was confirmed by objective control and Ukrainian social network users, despite that, the Kiev regime immediately tried to shift the accent from tangible military damage and accuse Russia of targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. And according to them, supposedly cluster munitions were being used for that. This version, as we can see also through the meeting today, was taken up by the European sponsors of the Kiev regime. We have on many occasions encountered a situation when the Ukrainian propaganda machine tried to present the consequences of the flawed work of their own air defense, to present them as targeted strikes by Ukrainian forces by Russian forces on Ukrainian infrastructure. But this can be easily refuted, all of those, including the instance today, and this is done through the video clips in the internet, the videos made by ordinary citizens. I would just like to recall a few examples here. In November 2022, for example, we were accused in targeted destructions of residential buildings in Kiev and Vyshgorod. This was quickly refuted when we saw video clips about the consequences of the work of air defense. In July 2023, we had the event having to do with the Transfiguration Cathedral in Odessa. At the time, in the network, there were videos in the internet showing that a missile defense missile is starting, cannot reach the needed height, and then goes down and explodes. And then when you see the explosion, you can see the spire of the belfry really clearly. Or there were attempts to place on Russia the blame on the strike against the Children's Hospital Ahmadet in July 2024, and this despite the fact that eyewitnesses filmed the moment that the Ukrainian air defense hit the building. This also includes the explosion of a school in Suma on 24th of March. This was presented as a targeted strike by Russian forces against civilian infrastructure. At the last meeting of the Security Council, we have very convincingly shown that that was also a fake. And now also the statements of the Kiev regime are being refuted by what we have in the social networks done by Ukrainian eyewitnesses from the place of the strike. They show a great volume of smoke and dust, and this means that a blast fragmentation charge was used and not cluster munitions. If this had been a cluster munition, an explosion cloud would not have been there at all. Instead of that, what you have heard would have been the explosions of submunitions, and according to eyewitnesses, there were no such explosions. I would like to repeat here today what we have already stated in this chamber. The Russian military only strike military targets, and also those targets which have to do with the military potential of the Kiev regime. We have stated many times that the Zelensky regime continues deploying their air defense in the residential areas of Ukrainian towns. I would like to put a question to USG Fletcher. Is that not a violation of international humanitarian law? Why is this not being talked about? As a result of what's being done by Ukrainian air defense, an absolute majority of the cases, they are the reason for the death and suffering of civilians. And in this regard, we very strongly recommend to all civilians to stay as far away as possible from the places where the Ukrainian or Western military servicemen are gathering, because a strike against such a legitimate target can be delivered at any point. Ukrainians, of course, are not being told the truth about that. The clique in Kiev will do everything they can to milk the tragedy they are responsible for the maximum propaganda effect, and our meeting today is an important element of this strategy. The good illustration of that is that the very day after the incident, we had an interview in YouTube, an interview with the chief of Ukrainian intelligence, Mr. Budanov, and he stated the following, and I quote, "There is absolutely no need to know the whole truth. Otherwise, people can come up with different kinds of opinions." End of quote. He also added to that and said that information should be provided in small doses and people can only expect to find out the whole truth later. Commenting these kinds of statements are pointless. They speak for themselves. Of course, no one is going to tell the Ukrainians about the atrocities that the nationalists conducted in the border Kursk Oblast, which they held since the beginning of August and from which they're being pushed out by the Russian forces. After the hamlet of Gusevo was liberated this morning, the Ukrainian army now is only in control of 2 border villages. And we did speak in detail about the crimes of Ukrainian nationalists at the Aria informal meeting on the 2nd of April. Nor will the Ukrainians be told about the continuous shelling of Russian border towns. In the past week alone, 8 civilians were killed as a result of that, and 106 wounded. Mr. President, our attention is drawn to the fact that information about strikes of Ukrainian military objects and Ukrainian towns is presented by the Zelensky regime as a fact showing that Russia is not ready for peace and is trying to undermine the peace initiatives of the new American administration. It is clear that these attempts, the goal they have is to undermine the American-Russian dialogue and torpedo the potential agreements that the Kiev regime will have to accept. But I have to disappoint you. What you're doing is far too obvious, and your statements are far too removed from reality to be able to believe them. You have betrayed yourselves when you started saying that the possible ceasefire could be used to pump Ukraine with weapons, to bringing new reserves to the fronts. And you showed this way that your interest is not at all in stopping military activities, but in making sure that the Ukraine can lick its wounds and resume its war down to the last Ukrainian in pursuit of your geopolitical interests. The scenario that's being discussed by Russia and the United States now consists not of that, obviously, but it's trying to find a sustainable long-term solution to the Ukrainian conflict. And what is needed for that is to do away with its root causes. They include pumping Ukraine with Western weaponry. And this, as we well know, started long before the special military operation of ours and was being conducted under the cover of Minsk agreements. We are ready to have a serious and practical dialogue, but we will not allow anyone to deceive us. We will not allow anyone to use this negotiating process in the interest of strengthening the Kiev regime's military potential. As we stated on many occasions, demilitarization is one of the goals of the special military operation of ours, and it will be implemented using military or negotiating means in such a way to make sure that Ukraine is no longer a threat to Russia. Therefore, our negotiating process on issues having to do with Ukrainian settlements and other issues continues fully in line with the Security Council Resolution 2774, passed on the 24th of February. At the same time, as we agreed with the new American team, Russia, since the 18th of March, has been refraining from strikes against the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. This cannot be said about the Zelensky regime. It continues shelling the Russian energy facilities basically on a daily basis. And the 4th to the 7th of April, there were 32 such attacks. How does this tally with the ceasefire proposal put forward by President Trump? This shows yet once again that you can't negotiate with the Ukrainian leadership, which lost its legitimacy almost a year ago, and convinces us once again that no agreements with the Kiev clique that usurped power are impossible. We hope that our American colleagues are also see this clearly. They have now an excellent opportunity to see the true intentions of those whom the British and European Party of War place its stake on. Thank you.
Je remercie Monsieur le représentant permanent de la...
I thank the permanent representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the Republic of Korea.
At the outset, I'd like to extend my gratitude to USG Tom Fletcher for his briefing. I also welcome the Ukrainian and other European representatives in today's meeting. Although reports over the last few weeks indicate a partial ceasefire has been agreed upon, it does not seem to be implemented. All the while, casualties continue to mount, and the recent developments in Ukraine only underscore this grim reality. Indeed, the horrific Russian ballistic missile attacks on Kryvyi Rih last Friday hit homes, a playground, shops, and a restaurant, killing 20 people, including 9 children, with over 70 injuries. As USG Tom Fletcher highlighted today, the ongoing indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian objects are unacceptable, indefensible under any circumstances. This is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. Children in particular are enduring deep wounds from this conflict that will take a lifetime to heal. According to UNICEF, over 2,500 Ukrainian children have been killed or injured since the war started, and thousands of children have been forcibly separated from their families. In this regard, the Republic of Korea welcomes all efforts for a swift end of the war and for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace, one that fully respects the principles and spirit of the UN Charter. Achieving this goal requires a sustainable ceasefire as a first step, but words alone, alongside partial, siloed agreements, are not enough. Instead, a comprehensive ceasefire backed by concrete action and true political will is needed. While we do not know the full details of the ongoing negotiations of the parties involved, or how long they will take, the situation on the ground seems stalled or even moving in the wrong direction. If this trajectory continues, it will only lead to more suffering and casualties. Based on our own experience of the 3-year-long Korean War, during armistice negotiations, the intensity of the conflict escalates and the casualties on the battlefields surge. In Ukraine, the situation could be worse. We are even witnessing increasing missile and drone attacks on densely populated towns and cities as negotiations are ongoing. Under this backdrop, there are additional ominous signs which are particularly concerning at the moment. The military cooperation between Russia and North Korea is intensifying rather than waning. This is exemplified by last month's high-level reaffirmation in Pyongyang to implement in full the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership signed last year. Also, ROK Intelligence, in close coordination with its partners, now assesses that more than 3,000 North Korean troops were deployed to the battlefield early this year, in addition to the over 11,000 soldiers dispatched last year. We reiterate our unequivocal call for Pyongyang and Moscow to immediately cease their unlawful military cooperation, which is a flagrant violation of the multiple Security Council resolutions. These developments cast serious doubt on the sincerity and the political will toward achieving a genuine ceasefire. To conclude, Mr. President, we believe that achieving a full freeze on hostilities pending the final settlement of the war should be treated as an urgent priority. This will minimize casualties and humanitarian suffering, as negotiations under complex conditions to bring an end to the war may continue for a while. Of course, we strongly hope that these negotiations will be completed as soon as possible in a manner that upholds the UN Charter. At this juncture, it is critical that the Security Council speaks with one voice in calling for an immediate stop to the fighting on all battlefronts. The Republic of Korea will continue to cooperate with the international community for the restoration of peace and the post-war reconstruction in Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the permanent representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
And I'd like to thank Undersecretary Tom Fletcher for your briefing. We extend sincere condolences to the families of those killed in the Russian Federation's ballistic missile strike in a residential neighborhood of Kryvyi Rih, next to a children's playground, which killed at least 20 people, including 9 children, and injured more than 70 civilians. We understand the missile carried a cluster warhead, accounting for the horrific loss of life. This attack is sadly only one in a series of terrible tragedies that have occurred over the past 3 years. It reminds us why ending this war as soon as possible must remain our focus. As this Council agreed in February, the killing and devastation must stop. Far too many civilians, especially children, have needlessly suffered and died while going about their daily lives. The United States is committed to achieving a just and lasting peace. In bilateral engagements with both Russia and Ukraine, the United States has proposed a comprehensive ceasefire. In March, Ukraine's representatives informed us that they were ready to accept the proposal. The Russian Federation's representatives insisted on more limited agreements, which would cover only strikes on energy infrastructure and elimination of the use of force in the Black Sea. Ukraine indicated agreement with those proposals. To achieve the goal of peace, both Ukraine and Russia must fully implement the ceasefire commitments they have already made in Riyadh. These initial steps, if fully implemented, will protect lives and improve livelihoods. Even more importantly, they could offer a basis for expanding a comprehensive ceasefire and negotiation towards a final, durable peace. We call on Russia and Ukraine to fulfill their commitments. The world is watching. We call on both sides to exercise restraint and demonstrate their commitment to peace is real. In particular, we urge the Russian Federation to bear in mind that strikes like those on Kryvyi Rih and executions of prisoners of war have the potential to damage peace efforts and all dependent discussions. The April 4th missile strike further underscores the need for an end to this devastating war, and we will ultimately judge President Putin's commitment to a ceasefire by Russia's actions. The United States remains ready to act as a partner on the path to peace. We call on all UN member states to join us in supporting efforts to achieve peace and in opposing any effort to widen or prolong this conflict. Mr. President, I say again, this war must end. We will have no patience for bad faith negotiation or violation of commitments. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Yeah. I wish to begin, Mr. President, by thanking USG Fletcher for his briefing. I also wish to thank him and all of his colleagues, particularly those who work tirelessly on the ground in the most difficult of circumstances. Mr. President, we are in the 3rd consecutive year of unabated devastation of a sovereign country. After tens of thousands of civilians dead or injured, and after the destruction of civilian infrastructure that will take hundreds of billions of dollars to reconstruct, Russia's aggression is not diminishing in the slightest. The attack on Kryvyi Rih last Friday is a case in point. What seems to have been a missile carrying a cluster munitions warhead sprayed shrapnel across a dense residential area, including a playground. 20 lives were lost in a heartbeat. Half of them were children. This makes the Friday attack the deadliest single strike harming children since the war began. We heard claims that a high-precision strike has been launched to target a military group that was meeting at a restaurant at the time, trying to justify it as a military target. Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights already disapproved this account, stating that all witnesses conveyed that there had been no military presence in the area at the time. I echo USG Fletcher in underlining that even in the time of war, civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. Attacks against civilians and civilian objects are a clear violation of international law, in particular IHL, and must not go unpunished. All those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity must be held accountable. Mr. President, we need peace in Ukraine. Attacks like the one in Kryvyi Rih are not only causing death and suffering among civilians, but are contravening the ongoing peace efforts. Slovenia remains hopeful that the US-led initiative will produce results. Effective moratoriums on energy infrastructure strikes and a truce in Black Sea might be the necessary first step in this regard. However, more than ever, we need a verifiable and lasting ceasefire that will pave the way to negotiations on enduring peace in Ukraine. Ukraine has already made the first step with agreeing to a full ceasefire, and we call on Russia to follow suit. Mr. President, Slovenia will continue to advocate for peace, just as it has done since the beginning of the aggression. We will continue working in this Council and elsewhere towards a just and lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia, in line with the UN Charter. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this briefing. I also thank USG Tom Fletcher for his important briefing. We welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Mr. President, as we mark day 1139 of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Sierra Leone remains deeply concerned about the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Over the past month, and even within this period of indirect negotiations, reported intense Russian drone, missile, and bomb attacks have targeted numerous cities and villages, particularly along the eastern, southern, and northeastern fronts. These attacks have caused significant damage to civilian infrastructure, including residential areas, shopping centers, and energy facilities, directly threatening the safety and well-being of the affected population. As tragically reported, on April 4th in Kryvyi Rih, a missile strike hit residential areas and a playground, resulting in 19 fatalities, including 9 children, and leaving many more injured. The United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has reported that 12,654 civilians have been killed and over 29,000 have been injured since 2022. UNICEF reports that more than 2,500 children have also been killed or injured in the conflict. With children consistently being harmed in major attacks since the beginning of 2025, we can only hope that a ceasefire is reached soon to prevent further destruction of Ukraine's next generation. Sierra Leone therefore continues to underscore the critical importance of adherence to international humanitarian law, which prohibits attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Protecting civilian lives must remain the highest priority in any conflict, as consistently reiterated by members of this Council. President, when we examine the various dimensions of the dire humanitarian situation, it is also concerning to note the report of the WHO that over 3.7 million men, women, and children remain internally displaced in Ukraine, forced to flee their homes. Moreover, lined mines and unexploded ordnance now contaminate an estimated 139,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory, further endangering civilians, particularly children, upon their return to their communities. OCHA has reported that approximately 36% of Ukraine's population requires some sort of humanitarian assistance. This highlights the severe impact of the conflict on the local population and the urgent need for increased humanitarian aid. We commend the health cluster partner organizations, including WHO, for their continued efforts in delivering life-saving health services to those in need. Sierra Leone emphasizes the critical importance of sustained and flexible funding for humanitarian recovery programs in Ukraine. This includes the collective humanitarian health response, which has received only 23 million of the 130 million it requires. Since January 2025, several health cluster organizations have had to halt their mobile and essential health services due to funding suspensions, affecting about 1.5 million people and 587 health facilities. Mr. President, what drives the dire humanitarian situation is the continuing hostilities. Sierra Leone reiterates that this conflict will not be resolved through military means. We therefore call on all parties to negotiate in good faith in the U.S.-led talks, taking into consideration the legitimate concerns of all involved parties. We urge negotiators and intermediaries to approach these discussions objectively, mindful of the contextual underpinnings of this conflict. In closing, Sierra Leone reaffirms its commitment to supporting international efforts aimed at alleviating the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine. As we move forward, it is essential that all parties prioritize the protection of civilians, respect for international humanitarian law, and the facilitation of humanitarian access to ensure the delivery of life-saving assistance to those in need. We call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank USG Fletcher for the briefing. The Ukraine crisis has dragged on to this day. The fighting still hasn't stopped, and the ordinary people are suffering immensely. Under no circumstance should civilians and civilian infrastructure become targets for attacks. The parties to the conflict should strictly observe international humanitarian law and make every effort to protect the safety of civilians and civilian infrastructure. The international community and humanitarian agencies should, on the basis of abiding by the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, make all efforts to carry out humanitarian assistance. President, at present, the Ukraine crisis is reaching a critical moment for a negotiated settlement. Although the situation on the battlefield remains complicated, the momentum for peace talks has already emerged, and the window of peace is opening. China welcomes the recent negotiations between Russia and the U.S. and between Ukraine and the U.S. and encourages all efforts leading to peace. As the conflict is taking place on the European continent, it's only natural for Europe to play its role for peace. We support the participation of all parties concerned and all stakeholders in the peace talks process to properly address the root causes of the crisis and to reach a fair, lasting, and binding peace agreement acceptable to all parties concerned. The Ukraine crisis involves complex problems. The parties still have notable differences in their positions and proposals on a range of key issues. Restoring peace will inevitably require persistent efforts and remains a daunting task. We hope that the international community will make more rational voices heard for a ceasefire and peace talks so as to create a positive atmosphere and enabling conditions for the political settlement of the crisis. President, since the first day of the outbreak of the conflict in Ukraine, China has been calling for political settlement through dialogue and negotiation. President Xi Jinping has put forward the 4 points what must be done, stressing that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be observed. The legitimate security concerns of all parties should be given due regard, and all efforts dedicated to peace should be supported. These 4 points have always been the fundamental guide for China on the Ukraine issue. Based on this guide, China put forth the 6-point consensus together with Brazil, sent its special envoy to engage in diplomatic mediation, and launched the Group of Friends for Peace on the Ukraine crisis with Brazil and other countries from the global south. The developments in the situation prove that China's proposals are objective, just, rational, and pragmatic, and reflect the broad consensus of the international community. China will continue to work with the international community to build consensus for peace, support peace efforts, and play a constructive role towards the political settlement of the crisis. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for this statement. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking Mr. Tom Fletcher, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, for his comprehensive briefings on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. I also want to welcome to this meeting the representatives of Ukraine and representatives of the region. The detailed assessment provided helps us inform the challenges facing civilian populations and the urgent need for continued humanitarian access. The recent incident in the civilian area have resulted in a deeply concerning civilian casualties, including children. The international humanitarian law is clear on the obligation to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure during the armed conflict. The broader impact on civilian infrastructures across multiple regions continues to compound the humanitarian challenges faced by the local populations. This development occurs at a crucial moment when diplomatic initiatives led by the United States have shown some promise. The recent agreement reached in Jeddah demonstrates that dialogue can yield tangible results. However, the continued impact on civilian population underscores the urgent need to strengthen these diplomatic channels and ensure their effective implementations. In light of this development, this Council might consider the following steps. First, supporting the enhanced humanitarian access to the affected populations. Second, strengthening the mechanism for civilian protection in accordance with international humanitarian law. Third, encouraging full implementation of recent diplomatic agreement. Fourth, promoting conditions conducive to sustained dialogue and de-escalation. Diplomatic efforts provide a foundation for further constructive engagement and improved conditions for civilian populations. The path forward requires sustained commitment to diplomatic solutions and unwavering adherence to the international humanitarian law. This Council's role in supporting both immediate humanitarian needs and longer-term peaceful resolutions remains essential. To conclude, Mr. President, my delegation reiterates its call for further strengthening the protection of civilians, support humanitarian access, and create conditions conducive to a peaceful resolution to this conflict. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Somalia for this statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank the USG, Mr. Tom Fletcher, for his briefing. Mr. President, on many occasions, Algeria has expressed and continues to express its deep concern over the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, which constitute a blatant violation of international law, including international humanitarian law. Although everyone here agrees on the need to protect civilians, we continue to record heavy losses in innocent civilian lives, including women, children, and the elderly. Monitoring reports also continue to indicate the destruction of civilian infrastructure due to the ongoing conflict in the region. Furthermore, for over 3 years, the suffering of peoples in Ukraine and Russia persists, where vast numbers of unarmed civilians have found no refuge but to flee conflict zones and move in search of a safe place to shelter themselves and their families awaiting a long-delayed final solution. Algeria has also highlighted and reiterates the impact of this war, not only on the peoples of the region, but on many parts of the world, especially developing countries, which are facing unprecedented energy and food crises. In the face of these grave challenges, we remain firmly convinced that the continuation of escalation has never been feasible, nor does it offer the sought-after peace to any of the parties. Furthermore, the logic of polarization will only exacerbate tensions and move us further away from any prospects to achieving sustainable peace in the region. Therefore, we would like to emphasize the following points. First, Algeria reiterates its call to both parties to demonstrate spirit of responsibility, prioritizing the safety of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and fully respecting their international commitments. We also express our hope that the ongoing diplomatic efforts recently initiated by the US will lead to a comprehensive and sustainable ceasefire. In this regard, we appreciate the efforts of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Second, we also renew our call to abandon the logic of escalation and confrontation and engage in a comprehensive, constructive dialogue in good faith, with the aim of reaching a just, lasting, and peaceful settlement to this conflict. Only diplomatic efforts and constructive negotiations can provide a sustainable solution built on the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and taking into account the legitimate security concerns of both parties. Third, the international community must, now more than ever, redouble its diplomatic efforts to bring the views of the parties concerned closer and create favorable conditions to facilitate dialogue and negotiations to end this crisis. We urgently need to put an end to this war and its devastating consequences, which have exhausted the peoples of the region and burdened the entire world, especially developing countries. Algeria remains committed to supporting any inclusive diplomatic efforts aimed at ending the suffering and achieving a peaceful and sustainable resolution to the war. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank USG Fletcher for the updates provided and welcome the participation in this meeting of the representatives of Ukraine, Czechia, Estonia, and Poland, as well as the European Union. Mr. President, we were distressed to receive several reports from the Ukrainian authorities about ballistic missile strikes in Kryvyi last Friday, in which 18 persons reportedly perished, including 9 children, and 62 others were injured. In their communication to the Security Council, Ukraine also indicated that the missile was equipped with a cluster warhead and struck residential buildings, playgrounds, and other civilian infrastructure. They further informed that early attacks in Kharkiv on 3rd April resulted in 5 civilian mortalities and injured more than 30, while on the night of 6th April, ballistic missiles targeted the city of Kyiv, and attack drones struck the surrounding region, again resulting in civilian casualties. Guyana is deeply alarmed that the calls of the Security Council and the international community for the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and for the parties to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law, continue to go unheeded. We reiterate that civilians should not be collateral damage in any armed conflict. IHL dictates that all efforts must be made to avoid civilian casualties and that they are not at all targeted. Mr. President, Guyana was hopeful that the promising momentum generated at the start of the year would finally bring an end to this war, and that the parties would embark on a diplomatic process towards achieving lasting peace. We are therefore deeply concerned that these escalatory actions are taking place against the backdrop of ongoing efforts to achieve a ceasefire. We reiterate our call for the parties to the conflict to demonstrate strong political will and engage in good faith toward ending the conflict peacefully and with full respect for the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. The scale of the destruction and ensuing humanitarian crisis is immense. Over 42,000 civilians, including children, have been reportedly killed or injured since February 2022. 11 million have been forced to flee their homes, with almost 7 million now living as refugees in other countries, as USG Fletcher reminded, and 3.7 million internally displaced. Many others have been abducted, arbitrarily detained, and subjected to conflict-related sexual violence and abuse. Even after the war ends, we fear that many more will be killed and injured, as Ukraine now has one of the highest prevalence of explosive remnants of war and landmines globally. This war has had and continues to have a devastating toll on the lives and livelihoods of civilians. The latest Joint Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment report puts the cost of direct damage at $176 billion by the end of 2024. Moreover, the report estimates that the total cost of reconstruction and recovery in Ukraine over the next decade will be $524 billion for both the public and private sectors. Even with such a detailed assessment, the full impact of this war remains incalculable. No assessment can adequately capture the human cost of war. What value can one place on the sanctity of human life, on the trauma and social and psychological impacts that will be carried for generations? Regrettably, these cannot be quantified. At what point is enough enough? Guyana continues to stress that there is no military option that brings lasting peace. We therefore continue to advocate for a diplomatic solution to end this war and insist that the United Nations, and by extension the Security Council, live up to its responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security and play a more active role in supporting the ongoing peace efforts. In closing, Mr. President, Guyana reiterates its call for the parties to the conflict to prioritize the protection of civilians and comply with their obligations under international law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We also call on member states to scale up support for the humanitarian response in Ukraine and to support the work of the UN and other agencies that are working around the clock to save lives and respond to the needs of those displaced. We will continue to work with fellow member states in support of the ongoing efforts to achieve lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Guyana for this statement and now give the floor to the Representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, I would like to thank Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher for his briefing. Mr. President, just a couple of weeks ago, the Council had met to discuss the devastating humanitarian impact of the Ukraine conflict. Regrettably, its toll on civilians and civilian infrastructure continues to mount. We express our sympathies with the families and loved ones of all those affected by this ongoing conflict. Mr. President, we would like to make the following 2 points on the matter under consideration today. First, Pakistan remains deeply concerned by the disproportionate impact of this conflict on civilians. The protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure is an obligation under international law and international humanitarian law, and must be fully and consistently respected by all parties. Second, It is vital that access and protection of humanitarian workers is ensured. The parties are under obligation to ensure conditions that allow unimpeded access for the humanitarian workers while ensuring their protection. Mr. President, on 24th February this year, this Council implored for a swift end to the conflict and urged a lasting peace between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. The subsequent limited ceasefire agreement reached last month on halting attacks against energy infrastructure and also in the Black Sea is a welcome development. We hope that the parties would earnestly abide by their commitments and use this momentum for achieving a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire, leading to a just, lasting, and durable peace. Pakistan's position on the Ukraine conflict has been consistent. From the outset, we have advocated dialogue and diplomacy for the immediate cessation of hostilities and a peaceful resolution. To conclude, Mr. President, I would like to reiterate Pakistan's support for the ongoing diplomatic efforts aimed at a just and durable settlement of this conflict through a constructive and inclusive process, in full respect of the UN Charter, international law, the relevant multilateral agreements, and addressing the legitimate national security interests of all sides. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for this statement. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the UK.
President, and I'd like to start by joining others in thanking USG Fletcher for briefing us today. As we've heard, on Friday, Russia's ballistic missile attack on Kryvyi Rih struck a residential area in the city, resulting in the deaths of 20 people, including 9 children, the youngest of whom was just 3 years old. At least 70 people were injured. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights described this as the deadliest single strike harming children since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. As High Commissioner Turk said, this attack was an unimaginable horror. 9 children killed, most while playing in a park as a military weapon exploded into shrapnel above them. We also saw Russia's attacks this weekend on Kharkiv and Kyiv, resulting in at least 5 more civilian deaths and many more injured. So we find ourselves here, once again, to condemn yet more Russian attacks that have killed and injured many Ukrainian civilians, in violation of the UN Charter and in violation of Russia's responsibilities as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. President Putin continues to stall the ceasefire proposal, dragging his feet and insisting on maximalist conditions, while intensifying drone and missile attacks on Ukrainian cities, which have now resulted in the deaths of 9 more innocent children. The Kremlin's actions reflect no desire for peace that I can detect. They are the actions of a government that remains hell-bent on destroying Ukraine, a government that disdains mediation efforts and holds cheap the lives of civilians. Under US leadership, a ceasefire proposal is on the table. The ball has been in Russia's court for weeks now. It's time for the Kremlin to stop stalling. It's time to show that they are committed to peace, as they claim to be. Because President Zelensky has made Ukraine's will clear. He wants to see the war end and has agreed to a full immediate and unconditional ceasefire, subject to Russia's agreement. It is time for the killing to stop. It is time for the Kremlin to end its aggression against Ukraine and to uphold its obligations under the UN Charter. It is time for President Putin to agree to a full and immediate ceasefire as a vital step towards negotiations to end the war for good. So our message to the Kremlin is that we will not be deterred by your reckless and barbaric actions. The UK will continue to stand resolutely by Ukraine to secure a just and lasting peace in line with the principles of the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of France. I'd like to thank Mr. Fletcher, Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Every sentence in that briefing is a scathing denial by Russia of the peace efforts of the United States and Ukraine, a nation under attack. 2 days ago, it was the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Volker Turk, who qualified the strike of Russia on Kryvyi Rih as an unimaginable horror, and I quote, "In using an explosive weapon with wide area effects in a densely populated area and without any apparent military presence, Russia demonstrates a reckless disregard for civilian life." End of quotation of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations. These are the facts. Russia, in recent days, has multiplied its attacks against residential areas of Ukrainian cities. Last Friday in Kryvyi Rih, 20 people, including 9 children, were killed. The day after that, a major attack was launched by Russian forces throughout Ukrainian territory. The indiscriminate strikes and the targeting of civilian infrastructure are far from being the only suffering that Russia imposes on the Ukrainian people. It's high time for Russia to return to their families the Ukrainian children that it has deported, to put an end to summary executions, torture, inhumane and degrading treatment, sexual violence against Ukrainian prisoners of war. All crimes fully documented by the United Nations. Russia must cease targeting humanitarian personnel. The secondary strike that Russia carried out on the 5th of April on Kryvyi Rih, when operations were underway to rescue people, is contrary to all international humanitarian law and cannot go unpunished. At the same time as it unleashes its attacks, Russia claims to want a ceasefire. But what are we speaking about? It was a month ago, day for day, that Ukraine accepted the US proposal for a complete ceasefire of 30 days. This courageous decision was not met with any response from Russia. On the contrary, Russia multiplied its maximalist preconditions while intensifying its military operations. And yesterday, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, Mr. Dmitry Peskov, said, and I state, Vladimir Putin supports the idea of a ceasefire, but a number of problems have to be resolved. In particular, and I quote again, the inability of the Kiev regime to control several extremist groups, and I'm still quoting, plans for the further militarization of Ukraine. These outstanding issues, as they are termed by Russia, are nothing more than unacceptable conditions for any sovereign state. With regard to the Black Sea, Russia is making the entry into force of a ceasefire contingent on 5 exorbitant demands. The Black Sea Grain Initiative was stopped in July 2023 because of these demands. It continues to instrumentalize global food security and accuses the West when the West's exports are genuinely continuing. Russia is not negotiating in good faith, it's procrastinating, and its goal continues to be the capitulation of Ukraine. But we, France, Europeans, are not sitting on our hands. We continue to work for securing peace. That's why there was a meeting held in Paris on the 27th of March at the initiative of the President of the Republic with Ukraine and 30 of our partners. Peace must be just, lasting, and in accordance with the United Nations Charter, namely protecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, as was reaffirmed once again by the General Assembly on the 24th of February last. Our commitment in this regard will not fail, and immediately France supports the efforts for a ceasefire and calls upon Russia to cease its operations, beginning with those affecting civilians and civilian infrastructure. I thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank French Presidency for convening today's Security Council meeting, and I am grateful to USG Mr. Fletcher for his substantive briefing. My delegation called this meeting because the Russian Federation does not want a ceasefire. Every missile, every strike drone, killing people every day, prove that Russia only wants war. It has not only failed to cease its attacks on Ukrainian civilians, it has significantly escalated scale and lethality of its assaults. Sunday, April 6, was the day of mourning in Ukraine after the most brazen attack carried out on April 4, which, according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, was the deadliest single strike harming children that the United Nations has verified since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022. The Russian Federation launched an Iskander-M ballistic missile at a residential neighborhood in the city of Kryvyi Rih, killing 20 people, of which 9 children. Over 60 civilians, among whom 12 children, sustained injuries of varying severity. The youngest victim, a 3-month-old baby. Staying silent about the fact that it is Russia killing children with ballistic missiles is wrong and dangerous. It only emboldens the scum in Moscow to continue the war and keep ignoring diplomacy. Weakness has never ended a war. That's why we are thankful to each and every member state whose representatives have spoken out. Our whole country is mourning children killed by the Russian terrorists in Kryvyi Rih. These are, according to Russian representative, military targets in Ukraine. Timofey, forever 3 years old. Radislav, forever 7 years old. Arina, forever 7 years old. Herman, forever 9 years old. Mikita, forever 15 years old. Danilo, forever 15 years old. Alina, forever 15 years old. Danilo and Alina were a couple, and they were buried yesterday together. Konstantin, forever 16 years old. Nikita, forever 17 years old. The attack on our children was carried out with exceptional cruelty. The Russian ballistic missile was equipped with a cluster warhead, deliberately designed to maximize casualties. It targeted a purely residential area during the early Friday evening, a time when many families were gathering ahead of the weekend. The missile landed near a playground and tore through homes, schools, and a restaurant. In addition to the ballistic missile, the Russian Federation launched attack drones against Kryvyi Rih during the rescue operation. The drone attack killed at least 1 person and injured 7 others. There is no deeper violence or hatred toward our people. This aligns with the so-called double-tap attacks perpetrated by terrorist organizations and replicated en masse by Russian Federation in its terror campaign against Ukraine and the Ukrainians. We categorically reject Russia's blatant falsehoods about alleged military targets in the area. Facts from the crime scene make it clear there were no military objectives in the vicinity. Russia's true aim was deliberately terror against civilians. Russia must be held accountable for everything it has done. To end this war, it is necessary to put pressure on them, real pressure, without wasting time on empty talk. We thank the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, whose team visited the site the following day to document the damage and identify the victims. It reported extensive destruction caused by shrapnel striking buildings, playgrounds, swings and slides, trees, and open ground. Again, all witnesses and footages from cameras inside and outside the local restaurant debunk Russian representatives' lies and disinformation, which we heard today, and in fact always. It confirms that there was no military presence at the restaurant or in the surrounding area at the time of the strike. We appreciate the efforts of UNICEF and its partners on the ground, who are supporting affected families and coordinating with local authorities to deliver emergency assistance. We welcome their call for an immediate end to attacks on civilian areas in Ukraine. A resolute international response to Russian atrocities is crucial. Such terror must never become the norm. We call for both strong condemnation and decisive actions. Russian Federation must stop its terror against Ukrainian people, respond to the US proposal for an immediate interim 30-day full ceasefire, which Ukraine has accepted, and end its war of aggression against my country. Unfortunately, yet not surprisingly, Russian Federation has refused to support full ceasefire initiative. Almost every day, in response to this proposal, Russia targets Ukrainian cities and villages with drones, bombs, artillery, and ballistic and cruise missile attacks. Mr. President, as Security Council members already underscored, not even 2 weeks have passed since the last Security Council meeting on Ukraine. But this was enough for Russia to cause significant loss of life and widespread destruction. 26 March, a massive attack on civilian infrastructure and residential areas in Kharkiv and the Kharkiv region. At least 12 civilians, including 2 children, injured. Same evening, Dnipro and Dnipropetrovsk region, one of the most intense drone attacks in 3 years, at least 3 civilians injured. 27 March, swarms of deadly Shahed drones attack residential areas of Dnipro and Kharkiv, other Ukrainian cities. Dozens of civilians injured, including children. Same day, an artillery strike on Kherson, killing a woman and injuring a man. 28 March, a massive attack with 172 strike drones, destruction across the country. In Dnipro, at least 4 civilians killed and 25 injured, including a pregnant woman. 29 March, missile strike on Kryvyi Rih, 9 civilians injured, 3 of whom hospitalized. Same evening, a massive attack on Kharkiv, 2 civilians killed and at least 35 others injured, including 5 children. 30 March, attacks across Ukraine, drones, artillery, and guided aerial bombs hit Cherkasy, Kherson, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Dnipro, Sumy, and Kharkiv regions. In Kupiansk, Kharkiv region, one of the 15 guided aerial bombs struck a 5-story residential building, injuring at least 4 civilians. 31st March, another drone attack on Kharkiv, at least 3 civilians injured. 1st April, artillery shelling of Krasny Liman in Donetsk region, destroying an utility building. Body fragments were found and handed over for identification. 2nd April, massive overnight attack with 74 drones and approximately 50 guided aerial bombs targeting Kharkiv, Odessa, and Sumy regions. In Kharkiv, at least 8 people injured, including 3 children. 2nd April, a Russian strike on Druzhkivka, Donetsk region, and on Kharkiv, where drones hit a 16-story residential building. At least 5 civilians injured, including a 10-year-old boy and 65-year-old woman. Same day, a ballistic missile attack, Kryvyi Rih, at least 4 civilians killed and 14 injured, including at least 2 children aged 8 and 6. 3rd April, a drone strikes on residential buildings in Kharkiv. At least 5 civilians killed, including a 12-year-old girl, 34 injured, including 2 children, 28 buildings damaged, leaving residents without gas, electricity, or heating. Kyiv, Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhzhia regions also under attacks that day. 4 April, in Brovary, Kyiv region, Russian drone attack injures 2 civilians. In Dnipro, another massive overnight drone attack injured at least 3 civilians and caused multiple fires. Same day, the Russian Federation struck Konstantinovka and Rodensky in Donetsk region. Mr. President, Moscow speaks about peace while launching brutal strikes daily on densely populated residential areas in major Ukrainian cities. These strikes are abhorrent and appalling war crimes constituting a grave violation of international humanitarian law. With these barbaric attacks against Ukrainian civilians and children, Russia demonstrates its complete disregard for international peace efforts led by the United States. Russia shows unrelenting will to continue its war of aggression against Ukraine. Let us keep it in perspective. Moscow has not moved 1 inch away from its genocidal and maximalist war aims. Russia continues to focus on elimination of Ukraine as a state and Ukrainians as a nation. It is now crystal clear that Russia is the major and only obstacle to peace. On the other hand, Ukraine has always been and remains committed to peace. We have taken concrete steps towards peace, unlike Russia, which continues to drag its feet and commit atrocities. Mr. President, only from the pressure of the world on the Russian Federation, from all collective efforts to strengthen Ukraine, our air defense, our forces, only on this depends when the war will end. Ukraine has clearly demonstrated our desire for peace and commitment to give peace a chance. No one wants peace more than our people. We need strong measures and decisive actions to push the Russian Federation toward peace before it kills more children and ruins the lives of more families. We can see that Putin does not want to end the war. He is looking for ways to preserve the option of reuniting it in any moment with even greater force. That's exactly why all forms of pressure on Russia must continue, strengthening our ability to defend ourselves, maintaining sanctions, and ensuring that diplomacy, any conversation with Moscow, leaves them no opportunity to kill. If there is a ceasefire, it must be unconditional, one that does not allow for the destruction of life. We will rebuild buildings and entire cities demolished by the Russian attacks. Ukraine already manages to do that. But we will never return the lives of our people. Russia must be held responsible for this war, and it will be. We continue working closely with our American and European partners to achieve a comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine, and Europe based on the principles of the UN Charter and with clear security guarantees. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, the head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you for convening this meeting, and of course, Under-Secretary General Fletcher for once again highlighting the consequences of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Dear colleagues, let us recall why we are in this room once again today. We have entered the fourth year of Russia's war of aggression, unprovoked, illegal, against an independent country, a member of these United Nations. And while Ukraine sues for peace, Russia continues its relentless attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. The past week has provided ample evidence of Russia's lack of interest in any ceasefire, with daily, deadly attacks. Russia's latest attack on the Ukrainian city of Kryvyi reportedly killed 20 people, including 9 children, most of whom were playing in a park. It was the deadliest single strike involving children, as verified by the UN Human Rights Office, since the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022. Russia's campaign of systematic airstrikes against Ukraine's civilians and civilian critical infrastructure violates international humanitarian law and must stop immediately. How many times have we said this in this room? How many times has Russia simply not listened? As stated on Sunday by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects by Russia in a densely populated area and without any apparent military presence demonstrates a reckless disregard for civilian life, unquote. There can be no impunity. Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for waging a war of aggression and for other most serious crimes under international law. The European Union reiterates its support for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine based on the UN Charter and international law. We welcome all efforts towards reaching such a peace. We welcome the efforts by the United States in this regard and by Saudi Arabia in hosting talks where Ukraine has demonstrated its readiness to accept a ceasefire without preconditions, which would constitute an important step in the direction of peace. Russia, on the other hand, decidedly has not. Instead of reciprocating, it has put forward preconditions for a partial ceasefire. We call on Russia to show its willingness to achieve peace without further delay. The European Union is ready to play its full part in supporting upcoming steps, together with Ukraine and other partners. I stress once again, there can be no negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine, and no negotiations that affect European security without Europe. In closing, Mr. President, I reaffirm the European Union's unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. The European Union will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes and as intensely as needed to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with international law, including the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, the Head of the European Union Delegation. I now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of the Czech Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me thank you for convening this important meeting. Colleagues, Czechia aligns itself fully with the statement delivered by the EU representative, but allow me to offer a few additional remarks in my national capacity. Although not a member of the Security Council, Czechia appreciates this opportunity to voice our profound moral outrage at Russia's recent attacks on civilian targets in Ukraine. From the outset, Czechia has unwaveringly supported Ukraine in its rightful exercise of self-defense as enshrined in the UN Charter against Russia's unprovoked and unjustified full-scale invasion. Moreover, Czechia has welcomed a substantial number of war refugees, nearly 500,000 in total, most of whom are women and children. As this brutal war of choice continues to rage dangerously close to our borders, we join others yet again in unequivocally condemning Russia's aggression. Russia's actions represent not only a direct threat to peace in Europe and thus to our own national security, but also fundamentally undermine the UN Charter and its most sacrosanct principles of territorial integrity and national sovereignty. Mr. President, today we find ourselves at a crucial juncture. Even as we witness diplomatic efforts aimed at securing a ceasefire, and despite Ukraine's clear readiness to fully embrace it, Russia continues and even intensifies its relentless attacks on Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure. Russia's brutal targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure over recent days demonstrates beyond any doubt who truly seeks peace and who instead is determined to prolong a ruthless war of territorial conquest. How else can we interpret the barbaric act of launching a missile loaded with explosive into the Ukrainian city of Kryvyi Rih, killing at least 20 innocent people, including 9 children? Suffice it to say, this has been independently verified by the United Nations Human Rights Office. This latest atrocity is Russia's true response to all international diplomatic efforts and reveals precisely how much Russia values peace. No one, not even Russia itself, can hide from these appalling facts or ignore this grim reality. We all earnestly desire an end to the bloodshed, the senseless killing, and the widespread destruction. Indeed, all this suffering can end immediately. All that is required is for President Putin's Russia to cease this senseless violence and withdraw its invading forces from Ukraine's sovereign territory. Mr. President, let me conclude by reaffirming my country's steadfast and unwavering commitment to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Czechia will continue to support Ukraine for as long as necessary and with all the determination required to secure a comprehensive, just, and a lasting peace, fully consistent with international law, including the principles of the UN Charter. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Czechia, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Estonia.
President, thank you for convening this meeting. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. We align ourselves with a statement by the European Union. We thank USG Fletcher for his valuable input and commend OCHA in Ukraine for their admirable efforts in mobilizing and coordinating aid to people whose lives have been upended by the war. President, since the UN Security Council last convened to discuss Russian aggression against Ukraine 2 weeks ago, Russia has significantly stepped up its killing of Ukrainian civilians and attacks against civilian infrastructure. The deliberate shelling of the civilian population in Kiev and Kryvyi Rih over the weekend is yet another war crime. Among the 20 civilians killed in Russian ballistic missile strikes in Kryvyi Rih, 9 were children. 9 were children. This abhorrent bombing with cluster munition of a residential area and a playground was conducted with the only aim to sow fear and terror. This is another reason Russia deserves to be listed in the annexes of the annual Children and Armed Conflicts report for carrying out grave violations against children in Ukraine. According to verified data, Russia has killed over 600 Ukrainian children since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022, while the real number might be much higher. In addition, the abductions and deportations of Ukrainian children continue, for which the ICC has already issued arrest warrant for Putin and Lvova Belova that constitute another reprehensible violation of international law. President, Russia does not act alone in its neo-colonial and imperial madness. The involvement of Iran, the DPRK, and Belarus in Russia's aggression against Ukraine must stop immediately. The transfer of weapons between the DPRK and Russia and the involvement of the DPRK's troops fighting on Russian side, constitutes a major escalation with far-reaching global consequences. President, since Russia's invasion, Ukraine has repeatedly expressed its unwavering commitment to reach a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. To exemplify its commitment, Ukraine has agreed to full and unconditional ceasefire. In contrast, Russia rejected the ceasefire proposal, has not taken any credible steps towards reaching peace, engages in ethnic cleansing and social engineering on the occupied territories of Ukraine, and keeps on raising its political demands. It is evident that Russia is deliberately dragging its feet in an attempt to deceive US negotiators, to conquer more Ukrainian territory, and to terrorize Ukraine's civilian population. As the Russian attacks against Ukraine have intensified significantly during last month, it's high time to also increase international pressure and to force Russia to peace in Ukraine. President, to conclude, we continue to stand by Ukraine and reiterate our collective efforts aimed at reaching a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter, the international law, and relevant UN General Assembly resolutions. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Estonia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Poland aligns itself with the statement delivered earlier by the European Union, and we are grateful for the account provided by USG Fletcher at the outset of the meeting. Last week, we witnessed another series of heinous Russian attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Here we want to express our deepest condolences to the families of those affected by the horrific Russian attack in Kryvyi Rih, account of which was provided in detail by our Ukrainian colleague moments ago. This deadliest attack involving children since the beginning of the war clearly indicates that there is not even a pinch of Kremlin's interest in any ceasefire. Instead of striving towards peace, Russia is systematically carrying out airstrikes against civilians and civilian infrastructure of Ukraine, blatantly violating international law. Poland, as stressed many times before, stands in solidarity with Ukraine in the face of Moscow's war of aggression. Mr. President, Russia continues to spread lies, disinformation, manipulate, and accuse Ukrainians of violating the humanitarian law. Moscow is sincere in one issue, though, and its actions prove it very clearly. Their final goal is to destroy Ukraine's statehood. Public statements made by the Russian MFA show that Moscow is trying to falsely present itself as a victim and expecting the world to provide it with security assurances, preferably at the expense of legitimate security interests of its neighbors. It is most curious that despite of Moscow's continuous pursuit of imperial and neo-colonial ambitions, as clearly demonstrated in Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine since 2014, it still tries to argue that its aggression is somehow an emanation of its supposedly peace-loving predisposition. Blaming others is much easier than seeing the man in the mirror. Now, that should be the first step for Russia and its leadership, if they were truly interested in peace. While Ukraine has agreed to a ceasefire without preconditions, Moscow has regrettably decided to decline the opportunity. Once again, we call on Russia to fully and unconditionally engage in efforts aimed at achieving peace. We welcome the US efforts to accomplish it, as well as Saudi Arabia's role as a host of peace talks. Mr. President, in conclusion, Poland remains committed to a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, based on the UN Charter and international law. We support efforts aimed at reaching such a peace, taking into account that no negotiations on Ukraine should be held without Ukraine, and that no negotiations affecting Europe should be conducted without Europe. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for his statement, and I now give the floor to Undersecretary General Fletcher to respond to the observations and questions that were put.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Just very briefly to respond to the question from the Russian Perm Rep put to me on international humanitarian law, particularly on how it applies to the military presence in residential areas. I think it's important to address this as it comes up across many of the crises with which we're dealing right now. 3 key points. Importantly, all parties to the conflict have to take constant care to spare civilians and protect civilian objects. So second point, that means for an attacking party, doing everything feasible to verify targets and take all feasible precautions in the choice of tactics and weapons. And yes, it also means that for the defending party, to the maximum extent feasible, avoiding locating military objectives within or near densely populated areas, and removing the civilian population where possible from the vicinity of military objectives. Thank you.
I thank Undersecretary General for his response. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.